The Indonesia Stock Exchange has launched the Indonesia Stock Exchange Industrial Classifications or IDX IC by today. Indonesia and Singapore market headlines is ready to provide you a number of information from business, economic, and capital market sector. With Nicola Randawijaya, and this is Market Headlines. And as viewers, the government has signaled the opening of independent vaccinations options. But the Minister of Health has confirmed that the goal of vaccines is not an exclusive policy for certain groups, so that the ministry will continue to review the regulations for implementing the independent vaccines.
Regarding the number of requests for independent vaccination, the government through the Minister of Health ensures that the vaccination policy will not be exclusive. Health Minister Budi Gunadi Sadikin explained that the vaccination is not only intended to protect a certain personal group. The aim of COVID-19 vaccination is to create herd immunity. In other words, vaccination must still be given evenly to all groups of society without prioritizing certain groups. The Minister of Health also said that the option of independent vaccination is open, but he ensures that all Indonesians still get their rights, namely getting the vaccine for free.
Ketiga hal itu tadi, ya. Satu, ini adalah sesuatu yang sifatnya berlaku untuk semua rakyat, harus terjadi di semua rakyat, nggak bisa hanya sekelompok saja, karena nggak ada gunanya juga. That is filosofinya bukan gitu. Yang kedua, vaksin ini harus diberikan semerata mungkin untuk segala macam golongan. Jangan sampai kelihatan satu golongan tertentu bisa mendapatkan akses yang lebih dulu. Karena saya yakin para TO pasti ingin dapat akses lebih dulu dan Anda mampu untuk dapat itu. Tapi tolong pikirkan seluruh rakyat Indonesia.
The Minister of Health said that the vaccination stage will be carried out for health workers as many as 1.4 million people from January to February. Then for public sector workers as many as 17 million people from March to April. And the next stage for the elderly as many as 25 million people. While vaccinations to the general public will be carried out by the end of April or May. From Jakarta, Raharjo Patna for IDX Channel.
Economic observers asked the government to seriously examine the discourse to open an independent vaccinations permit. Apart from the equal distribution factor, independent vaccinations can make prices run out of control, and if it's not regulated in the detail and firmly by the government.
The discourse of conducting independent vaccination for the middle and upper class of society must be seriously studied by the government. The Executive Director of CORE Indonesia, Muhammad Faisal, explained that there are several positive and negative consequences that the government must anticipate. The positive impact of independent vaccination is to reduce the financial burden of the state. In addition, it can accelerate the distribution of vaccines with private sector participation. But the government must also be prepared for the negative impacts that may occur, such as insufficient supply of vaccines or the impact on uncontrolled vaccine prices.
Kelangkaan karena demand-nya tiba-tiba mengalami peningkatan. Lalu yang ketiga juga yang harus diperhatikan adalah dari sisi kesenjangan ya antara yang kalangan miskin dan kalangan atas ya. Jadi artinya ini tetap semestinya tidak mengurangi daripada kecepatan dan juga kecepatan dari pemerintah dalam mendistribusikan vaksin di kalangan bawah, terutama kalangan miskin, gitu. Karena tetap saja ini harus cepat dieksekusi sejalan dengan semakin meningkatnya juga dari sisi penyebaran wabah.
It is hoped that independent vaccination will not increase the gap in treatment facilities between the poor and rich, so that the existence of independent vaccines does not reduce the speed of the government in distributing vaccines to various regions. From Jakarta, Raharjo Patmo, IDX Channel.
SOE Minister Erick Thohir emphasized that Indonesia's foreign sovereign wealth fund is different from sovereign wealth fund owned by the neighboring countries. It is because the establishment that was based on the government's desire to accelerate investment by looking for a partner, not by debt.
The government has been very close in establishing an investment management institution or sovereign wealth fund. Even the name of the supervisory board candidate proposed by President Joko Widodo has been approved by the House of Representatives. SOE Minister Erick Thohir stated that the sovereign wealth fund formed by the government is very different from sovereign wealth funds in neighboring countries, because the goal of establishing a sovereign wealth fund is none other than the government's desire to accelerate investment by looking for partners, not with debt.
Yang tidak kalah pentingnya pada saat ini, agenda pemerintah yang terakhir, Sovereign Wealth Fund, yang tidak lain kita ingin mempercepat daripada investasi yang ada di Indonesia, tetapi tidak dengan hutang, tetapi kita mencari tambahan modal dengan berpartner. Dan ini yang kita harapkan, bahwa Sovereign Wealth Fund juga yang sangat berbeda dengan sovereign tetangga, yang dimana kemarin ada kasus-kasus sedikit seperti 1MDB atau lainnya.
Erick added that the sovereign wealth fund will later focus on national assets, so it is hoped that partnership with other investors can have a positive impact on local entrepreneurs and local residents who are close to related investments. From all sources, for IDX Channel.
The Indonesia Investment Coordinating Board, or BKPM, reported that investment realizations in the fourth quarter of 2020 reached 214.7 trillion rupiah, or the number grew by 3% year-on-year. And from the total investment, the number of workers absorbed reached more than 294,000.
The Indonesia Investment Coordinating Board, or BKPM, reported that investment realization in the fourth quarter of 2020 reached 214.7 trillion rupiah, or grew by 3% year-on-year. From the total investment, the number of workers absorbed reached more than 294,000. The head of BKPM, Bahlil Lahadalia, said that foreign direct investment, or FDI, opened a higher growth than domestic investment, or DDI, at the end of 2020. From BKPM's records, FDI reached 111.1 trillion rupiah, or 51.7% from the total investment, an increase compared to the previous year. Meanwhile, domestic direct investment reached 103.6 trillion rupiah, or 48.3% of total investment.
Kenapa sih kuartal keempat PMA-nya lebih besar? Kita tahu bahwa di kuartal keempat di mana kasus pertama pandemi COVID itu sudah ada vaksinasinya. Itu sudah membuat rasa percaya diri dari teman-teman investor asing yang ada di Indonesia. Yang kedua adalah pengesahan terhadap Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja itu cukup memberikan pengaruh yang positif bagi keberlangsungan investor asing yang ada di Indonesia.
In addition, BKPM sees the ratification of the Job Creation Law as having a positive impact on foreign investors. As a result, FDI increased quite sharply in the last quarter of 2020. Meanwhile, based on the country, Singapore dominated FDI with $2.6 billion in the fourth quarter of 2020, followed by China. From all sources, for IDX Channel.
Market headlines will be right back. Stay tuned. I'm Clara Antawijaya. I'm associate producer and news presenter on Market Headlines. as market headline starts at 4:30 p.m., which is in line with the closing market. Therefore, we summarize the market conditions only for you. And my job in here as a journalist, I give concise and accurate news for the audience. And also, being a journalist is not only a job for me, but it is also a passion.
Ya, Otoritas Jasa Keuangan telah resmi menerbitkan belit yang mengatur modal inti minimum bank. Dengan penerbitan aturan ini,
bank ini heavily regulated, Mas. Jadi bank itu nggak bisa pindah tangan begitu saja, harus approval oleh OJK. Jadi
Menteri Keuangan Sri Mulyani Indrawati mengatakan bahwa industri keuangan syariah tumbuh mengesankan.
Di masa pandemi ini kita masih bisa bertahan dan bahkan menunjukkan kinerja yang sangat baik.
Welcome back to Market Headline. By December 2020, the Home Affairs Ministry confirmed that Indonesia's population had totaled 271,349,000 people. 271 million people is the latest population data based on the synchronizations of the results of 2020 population census by Statistic Indonesia and Populations Administration data from the Directorate General of Populations and Civil Registrations of the Ministry of Home Affairs. Head of Statistic Indonesia, Suharyanto, said that the increase in the recorded populations was due to an increase in population growth rate of 0.14% from September to December 2020. There are some factors that push the population's growth rate during the moment.
Terjadi karena dipengaruhi faktor kelahiran, kematian, dan juga faktor migrasi. Jumlah penduduk akan bertambah karena adanya kelahiran dan migrasi masuk, sedangkan jumlah penduduk akan berkurang karena adanya kematian dan juga migrasi keluar.
Based on the Statistic Indonesia, until September 2020, Indonesia's total populations was recorded at 270 million people. Statistic Indonesia head Suharyanto explained that the count of Indonesians' populations was obtained due to a long-drawn process from the results of the online population census and field data collection. That was then synchronized with the ministry's data. Jakarta, Gilang Praditya for IDX Channel. Yes, viewers, it took thousands of years for the world's populations to reach 5 billion people in 1987. But however, since then, it has only taken 33 years for the global populations to skyrocket to reach 8 billion people in 2020. Some countries have largest populations in the world compared to other countries, for example, China, India, United States, and also Indonesia. And to see the details, let's see to the next graphic. Here it is. Through the next graphic, we can see countries with the highest populations around the world. First of all, we got China, which populations reaching beyond 1 billion people. Certainly 1.4 billion people live in China. And how about India? The next one is India, by 1.3 billion people living in India. And moving on to United States, we can see that 331 million people live in the United States. And moving on to our country, Indonesia, which through the Ministry of Home Affairs It is recorded that there are 271 million people live in Indonesia in 2020. And moving on to the country with the highest population, we can see that there is Pakistan with the number of 220 million people live in Pakistan. So overall, we can see that Indonesia is the fourth highest populated country in the world. So meanwhile, it is projected that the total population's growth of these five countries will account for half of the total global populations by 2050. And whereas the populations on Earth in 2050 is expected to touch 9.2 billion. And when we talk specifically about Indonesia, Statistik Indonesia is the agency that holds the census. In 2020, for the first time in the history of Indonesia, government used combinations method. The data is combinations between Statistik Indonesia and the Populations Administration's data from Directorate General of Populations and Civil Registrations of the Ministry of Home Affairs. And therefore, let's see the result in the next graphic. Through the next graphic, we can see the Indonesia total populations as for a 10 years period. Starting from 1980, which there was only 147 million people live across Indonesia. And moving on to 1990, there were 179 million people live in Indonesia, and jump into 2020. Based on the latest data, we know that there are currently 271 million people living in Indonesia. We can see that the gap is really significantly leap off. And 271 million people is the latest populations data based on the synchronizations of the results. Whereas in September, Indonesia's total populations was recorded as 270 billion people. But the data was reviewed by the Home Affairs Ministry. So if we see the previous population census through the previous graphic, we can see that the populations of Indonesia has continued to increase from time to time. Even from the data that we can see that within 10 years, Indonesia's population's growth rate reached around 1.25% per year, or 0.4% slower than the previous period. With a land area of 1.92 million square kilometers, Indonesia's population density is 141 people per square meter. And although its geographical area is only 7% of the entire territory of Indonesia, Java Island is still the most populous with 151 million people, or 56% of Indonesia's populations. And there are other populated islands as well in Indonesia, so let's see through the next graphic. To your screen, we can see that there are most populated islands. First of all, we can examine the Java Island, which is the largest populations of Indonesia, is still on Java Islands by 56.1%, and moving on to Sumatra by 21%, and the next one is Kalimantan by 6%, Sulawesi by 7%, and Bali and also Nusa Tenggara combined reaching 5%. And of course, back again, the largest populations of Indonesia is still on the Java Island with 151 million people, as mentioned before, or the proportions is 56% of the total populations in Indonesia, and followed by Sumatra with 58 million people, or 21% of it, and then Sulawesi with 19.9 million people, or 7%, and Kalimantan 16 million people, and Bali and Nusa Tenggara combined together to be 15 million people, are contributing 5%. And there are also Maluku and Papua, which is 8.6 million people. And plus, there is another interesting fact about Indonesia's demographic. The population is more than female. The male populations is more than the female populations. For example, male population reach 50.58%, while female populations is less dominated by 49%. With this figure, the sex ratio of Indonesia's populations is 102, which means that there are 102 men for every 100 women in Indonesia by 2020. So we've talked about the density, about the sex ratio. How about the age? I will reveal an interesting data about that in the next graphic. Here it is. Through the next graphic, we can see the age proportions of Indonesia's demographic. This is very interesting because it is dominated by Generation Z and also the millennials. So first thing first, we can see that the proportions of Generation Z is 27.94% of the total demographic in Indonesia. And moving on to the baby boomer, which is only accounted for 31 million people of it. And Generations X by 58 million people, and post Generation Z, which is very young, which is 29 million people. And then moving on back again, the proportions of the Generation Z is 27.94% of the total populations, while millennial generations is 21% of the total populations in Indonesia. Thus, it means that Statistik Indonesia notes that Indonesia is still at the window of opportunity to enjoy the demographic bonus. And according to PwC, Indonesia is predicted to experience a demographic bonus from 2020 to 2035 as a result of robust economic growth. And yes, viewers, we can use these demographic bonus optimally, then Indonesia certainly can accelerate the economic growth and improve the people's welfare. And that's all for today's infographic. Don't go anywhere because market headlines will be right back after this quick break.
Saya kedatangan tamu nih, kasih ide dari pesantren. Bilang kenapa sih kita nggak buat suatu kosmetik yang islami, bagus, harganya bersaing. Sebetulnya usaha ini sukses bukan karena saya ya. Usaha sukses kan karena karyawan saya. Tahun 90 saya dapat cobaan lah ya, ujian dari Allah, kebakar habis, minus. Kenapa saya bisa bangkit kembali? Ya saya pikirkan nasib karyawan.
Transisi ke energi baru dan terbarukan tidak membuat industri energi fosil lantas surut. Seperti apa dampaknya terhadap sektor migas?
Turunnya atau rendahnya harga minyak dan gas yang sangat drastis turunnya, adanya pandemi yang membuat terbatasnya pergerakan.
Langkah yang dilakukan apa nih Pak?
Hingga hari ini saya kira brand hari ini sekitar 55. Ini sesuatu yang positif untuk industri yang itu kira.
Welcome back to Market Headlines. So viewers, let's take a look at Jakarta Composite Index intraday movement. So earlier today, JCI was open at level of 6,322.52, and then approaching the closing time in the first session, the index was on the level of 6,219.72, and the index was showing weakening trend by the second session closing time. The index was closed at level of 6,258.57. In short, JCI went down 0.77%. And next, we are going to see the sectoral movement. Leading the dynamics of today's trading, we got finance as the leader of the strengthening trend that went up 0.09%, while constructions went down 2.66%, agriculture went down 2.61%, and trade went down 0.65%. And moving on to the top gainers and the top losers, here are the key highlights from today's trading session. We got BPRI that went up 1.27%, we got tins that went up 1.36%. Then we got BMRI that went up 1.39%, and INKP that went up 3.08%. And meantime, for the top losers for today's trading session, we got ANTM that went down 0.35%. We got Waskita that went down at 6.76%. We got Astra International that went down at 3.36%. And Telkom Indonesia that went down 0.59%. And next, we're going to see the intraday movement of rupiah towards US dollar. So rupiah opened at level of 14,082. Rupiah was also showing weakening trend towards US dollar. I was closed at level of 14,028. In summary, rupiah went down 0.04%. The Indonesia Stock Exchange has launched the Indonesia Stock Exchange Industrial Classifications, or IDX IC, by today. IDX IC will replace the current Jakarta Stock Industrial Classification. Indonesia Stock Exchange Industrial Classifications, or IDX IC, will replace current index, so-called as JASICA, or Jakarta Stock Exchange Industrial Classification. IDX will not cut JASICA immediately, but will go on transitional period in the next 3 months since the new index has launched. The difference of two indexes is the principle. JASICA uses the principle of classifications based on the economic activity, while IDX IC uses the principle of market exposure. And talk about classification, JASICA classifies listed companies into 2 layers of classifications, namely 9 sectors and 56 subsectors, while the IDX IC classifications consist of 4 more detailed classification layers, namely 12 sectors, 35 subsectors, 69 industries, and 130 industries. From all sources, IDX Channel. Step aside from market condition, as coronavirus pandemic takes a big role on current economic situations, here it is an update data about coronavirus globally. News close on market headlines today. Please enjoy our next program on IDX Channel, your trustworthy economic, business, and capital market channel. I'm Clara Antawijaya. Have a nice evening and stay safe.
DKI Jakarta akan kembali menerapkan pembatasan sosial berskala besar.
Kita akan menarik rem darurat, yang itu artinya kita terpaksa kembali menerapkan pembatasan sosial berskala besar.
Bagaimana Anda melihat kondisi dari pandemi COVID-19 sampai sejauh ini?
Yang paling akan langsung terkena dampaknya adalah orang-orang yang bekerja di sektor informal.
Halo pemirsa, apa kabar Anda di hari ini? Senang sekali saya Fajar Wayong kembali menjumpai Anda dalam program Hangout. Program yang akan mengajak Anda untuk mengenal lebih jauh emiten-emiten yang ada di Bursa Efek Indonesia. Dan kali ini saya akan mengajak Anda untuk berkunjung dan melihat langsung operasional dari emiten produsen kakao dan olahan coklat premium PT Wahana Interfood Nusantara Tbk langsung dari